Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the crowded veterans' bar, her weathered hands wrapped around a cold beer bottle. The dim lighting cast shadows across her face, highlighting the thin scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen more than most people could imagine. The bar was alive with laughter and stories from former military personnel sharing their experiences. Sarah listened quietly as a group of Marines recounted their deployment stories, their voices growing louder with each round of drinks. She had been coming to this place for 3 months now, ever since moving to the small Colorado town of Pine Ridge. It was the only place where she felt somewhat at home among people who might understand her past. "So what about you, Sarah?" called out Marcus, a former Army sergeant who had befriended her over the past few weeks. "You never talk about your service. What branch were you in?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her fingers unconsciously tracing the rim of her beer bottle. She had hoped to avoid this conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. In a town like Pine Ridge, everyone eventually shared their story. "Navy," she said simply, hoping that would be enough to satisfy their curiosity. "Navy, huh?" Marcus grinned. "What did you do? Were you on a ship?" The conversation around their table had quieted, and Sarah could feel several pairs of eyes on her. She took a long drink from her beer, buying herself time to think. The truth was complicated, more complicated than these well-meaning veterans could possibly understand. "Special operations," she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. The response sent a ripple of interest through the group. Special operations meant something significant in military circles, and Sarah could see the questions forming in their minds. Like what kind of special operations? Pressed Jake, a former Air Force pilot whose curiosity always seemed to get the better of him. Sarah met his gaze steadily. She had reached a crossroads where half-truths would no longer suffice. These people had welcomed her into their circle, shared their own stories of combat and brotherhood. They deserved honesty, even if it meant revealing secrets she had kept buried for years. "I was a SEAL," she said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Every conversation in their corner of the bar seemed to stop at once. Marcus nearly choked on his drink, and Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. "A SEAL?" Marcus repeated, his voice filled with skepticism. "Like Navy SEALs?" Sarah nodded, knowing full well what was coming next. She had seen this reaction before, the mixture of disbelief and suspicion that crossed people's faces when she revealed this part of her past. "That's impossible," Jake said, shaking his head. "Women can't be SEALs. They just opened those programs to women a few years ago, and no woman has ever actually made it through BUDS training." The other veterans at the table murmured their agreement. Sarah had expected this response, but it still stung. She had spent years proving herself in ways these men could never imagine, had bled and sacrificed and lost pieces of herself in service to her country. And yet, because of her gender, her very existence as a SEAL was considered impossible. "I know how it sounds," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm despite the growing tension at the table. "But it's the truth. Look, Sarah," Marcus said, his tone becoming more confrontational. "We've all served our country, and we respect each other's service here. But claiming to be something you're not, especially something as elite as a Navy SEAL, that's stolen valor. That's serious." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Stolen valor, the charge leveled against people who falsely claimed military achievements they had never earned. She had given everything to earn her place among the most elite warriors in the world, had endured trials that would have broken most people, and now she was being accused of lying about it. "I'm not lying," Sarah said, her voice taking on an edge that made several people at nearby tables turn to look. "Prove it then," Jake challenged. "Show us some documentation." "Every SEAL has records, photos, something." Sarah's jaw tightened. The documentation of her service was classified at levels these men didn't even know existed. The photos from her operations would never see the light of day. The very nature of her missions meant that officially she had never existed as a SEAL. "I can't show you that," she admitted. "Of course you can't," Marcus said, standing up from his chair. "Because you're lying." The confrontation was escalating quickly, and Sarah could see that other patrons were beginning to take notice. Some of the older veterans looked angry, their faces flushed with indignation at what they perceived as a grave insult to their brotherhood. "This is bullshit," Jake said, pulling out his phone. "You know what? I'm calling the police. Stolen valor is a federal crime. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been in worse situations than this, had faced down enemies in places where backup was hours or days away. A confrontation in a small-town bar should not have rattled her, but the accusation of stolen valor cut deeper than any enemy fire ever had. "Go ahead and call them," she said quietly. "Call whoever you want." Jake dialed 911, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Yes, I'd like to report someone committing stolen valor at Murphy's Bar on Main Street. Woman claiming to be a Navy SEAL." As they waited for the police to arrive, the atmosphere in the bar became increasingly hostile. Word spread quickly through the establishment about what was happening, and soon Sarah found herself surrounded by angry veterans who felt personally insulted by her claims. She sat quietly at the table, finishing her beer and preparing herself for what was to come. The police would arrive, they would take statements, and she would likely be arrested. The investigation that followed would uncover her classified service record, but that process could take days or weeks. In the meantime, she would be branded as a fraud, her reputation destroyed in the community she had hoped to call home. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers entered the bar. They were both young, probably in their late 20s, and they looked somewhat overwhelmed by the crowd of agitated veterans that greeted them. Sarah watched as Marcus and Jake approached the officers, their voices animated as they explained the situation. One of the officers, a tall man with sandy hair and sergeant's stripes, approached Sarah's table. His name tag read Coleman. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning," he said, his tone professional but firm. Sarah nodded and stood up, placing a $20 bill on the table to cover her drinks. As she was led toward the door, she could hear the angry murmurs of the crowd behind her, their voices filled with disgust and betrayal. She had expected this day might come eventually, but she had hoped it would be on her own terms. The Pine Ridge Police Station was a modest building that reflected the small-town nature of the community. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in interview room B, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the chaos that was unfolding around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the raised voices of the veterans who had followed the police to the station, demanding justice for what they perceived as a grave insult to their military brotherhood. Sergeant Coleman sat across from her at a scratched metal table, a notepad and pen in front of him. His partner, Officer Davis, leaned against the wall by the door, occasionally glancing at his phone as it buzzed with what Sarah assumed were calls from reporters who had somehow already gotten wind of the story. "So let me get this straight," Coleman said, reviewing his notes. "You're claiming to be a Navy SEAL, but you can't provide any documentation to support that claim." "That's correct," Sarah replied evenly. "My service records are classified." Coleman and Davis exchanged a look that clearly conveyed their skepticism. Sarah had seen that look countless times before. The expression of people who believed they were dealing with either a delusional individual or an outright fraud. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Davis spoke up from his position by the door, "that's what they all say. Every week we get someone claiming to be a former Special Forces operator with classified records. It's always the same story." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only reinforce their assumptions. The truth was that her records were indeed classified, but at a level that local police would never be able to access. The operations she had participated in were so sensitive that officially, they had never happened. "Look," Coleman continued, his tone becoming more sympathetic, "I can see you're a veteran. I can tell by the way you carry yourself, the way you respond to questions. I'm betting you served honorably in some capacity. But this SEAL thing, it's just not possible for someone like you." The phrase "someone like you" hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew exactly what he meant, and the casual dismissal of her capabilities based on her gender was something she had endured throughout her military career. "I understand your skepticism," Sarah said quietly, "but I'm telling you the truth." The door to the interview room opened, and a woman in her 50s wearing a lieutenant's uniform entered. Sarah recognized the look of a seasoned law enforcement officer who had seen everything the job had to offer. "I'm Lieutenant Patricia Hayes," the woman said, settling into a chair next to Coleman. "I've been briefed on the situation. Ms. Martinez, do you understand the seriousness of the charges being leveled against you?" "I do," Sarah replied. "Stolen valor is a federal offense," Hayes continued. "If you're found guilty, you could face significant fines and imprisonment. More than that, you're causing real harm to legitimate veterans who earned their honors. Through blood and sacrifice, Sarah felt a flash of anger at the implication that she had not earned her honors through blood and sacrifice. The scars on her body told a different story, as did the nightmares that still woke her in the middle of the night. But she forced herself to remain calm. "I understand the gravity of the situation," she said. Hayes studied Sarah for a long moment, her experienced eyes taking in details that the younger officers had missed. Sarah's posture, the way her eyes constantly scanned the room for potential threats, the unconscious way she positioned herself to have clear sight lines to both the door and the window. "You served, didn't you?" Hayes said finally. "Maybe not as a SEAL, but you definitely served." "Yes, ma'am. 23 years in the Navy. What was your rate?" Sarah hesitated. Her official rate had been Intelligence Specialist, a cover that had allowed her to move between different units and operations without drawing attention. "Is Intelligence Specialist." Hayes nodded, making a note. "That's a respectable rate. Good career field. Why not stick with that instead of claiming something you're not?" The question struck at the heart of Sarah's dilemma. Her official record would show a distinguished career as an intelligence specialist, with numerous commendations and deployments to various hotspots around the world. It was a perfectly honorable service record that any veteran could be proud of, but it wasn't the whole truth. "Because that's not the whole story," Sarah said. "Then tell us the whole story," Coleman said, pen poised over his notepad. Sarah took a deep breath. She had kept these secrets for so long that speaking about them felt foreign, almost dangerous, but she was running out of options. "In 2003, I was selected for a special program," she began. It was off the books, not part of any official Navy training pipeline. The Navy needed someone who could pass as a civilian, someone who could operate in environments where a traditional SEAL team would be too conspicuous. The three officers listened intently as Sarah continued her story. She told them about the grueling selection process that had lasted for months, conducted at a facility that didn't appear on any military maps. She described training that had pushed her beyond what she thought were her physical and mental limits, exercises designed to break candidates who weren't completely committed to the mission. "They called us Ghost SEALs," Sarah said. "We operated in small teams, usually 2 or 3 people in countries where the United States officially had no military presence. Our missions were always deniable, always off the books," Davis snorted. "Ghost SEALs? Come on, that sounds like something out of a movie." "I know how it sounds," Sarah replied. "That was the point. We were designed to be unbelievable, to exist in the spaces between official military operations." Hayes was taking detailed notes now, her expression more thoughtful than skeptical. "How many operations did you participate in?" 47 missions over 15 years, Sarah answered without hesitation. "Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, places where regular forces couldn't operate without creating international incidents." "And you're saying there's no record of any of this?" "There are records, but they're compartmentalized at levels you don't have access to. My official service record shows deployments as an intelligence specialist attached to various support units. The real nature of my work is buried under layers of classification." Coleman looked up from his notes. "If all of this is true, then why are you here? Why aren't you still serving?" Sarah's expression grew distant, and for the first time since her arrest, the officers could see cracks in her composed facade. "My last mission went wrong," she said quietly. "My partner was killed and I was severely injured. The nature of our work meant there could be no official investigation, no Purple Heart ceremony, no military funeral for my partner. We were ghosts, and ghosts don't get memorials." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over them. Hayes was the first to speak. "Ms. Martinez, these are very serious claims you're making. If even a fraction of what you're saying is true, then we're dealing with matters far beyond the scope of local law enforcement." "I know," Sarah said. "I tried to warn you." Hayes stood up and motioned for her colleagues to follow her out of the room. "We need to make some calls. Ms. Martinez, you're going to remain here while we verify your story." As the officers filed out, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. She knew that the verification process they were about to undertake would likely hit dead ends and classified walls. The very nature of her service meant that traditional channels of confirmation were blocked. But she also knew that somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the military and intelligence community, there were people who knew exactly who she was and what she had done. The question was whether any of those people would be willing to speak up for a ghost who was supposed to remain invisible forever. Outside the interview room, she could still hear the angry voices of the veterans who had accused her of stolen valor. They were demanding answers, demanding justice for what they saw as a betrayal of everything they held sacred. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to push away the memories that her interrogation had stirred up. Images of missions in hostile territory, of her partner's final moments, of the moment when her carefully constructed cover identity had become her only reality. She had traded her ghost status for a chance at a normal life. But normal life, it seemed, came with its own set of challenges. By the time the sun rose over Pine Ridge the next morning, Sarah's story had exploded across social media and local news outlets. The Pine Ridge Police Department's phones rang constantly with calls from reporters, bloggers, and military advocacy groups, all demanding information about the woman who claimed to be a female Navy SEAL. Sarah sat in her holding cell, listening to the commotion echoing through the station. She had been moved there after the initial interview when it became clear that verifying her story would take more than a few hours. The cell was small and sparse, with a narrow cot, a metal toilet, and a single window that looked out onto the parking lot where news vans were beginning to gather. Lieutenant Hayes appeared at the cell door with a cup of coffee and a grim expression. "Ms. Martinez, we need to talk." Sarah looked up from where she had been sitting on the edge of the cot, her back straight despite the uncomfortable accommodations. "What's the situation?" "The situation is that your story has gone viral," Hayes said, unlocking the cell door. "Someone at the bar last night recorded video of your arrest and posted it online. Now every military blog and news outlet in the country is running with the story of the woman who claims to be a secret Navy SEAL." Sarah followed Hayes back to the interview room, noting the increased activity in the station. Additional officers had been called in to handle the media attention, and she could see through the windows that protesters had joined the reporters outside. "It gets worse," Hayes continued as they sat down. "We've been trying to verify your claims through official channels, but we're hitting walls everywhere we turn. The Navy Personnel Command says your official record shows service as an intelligence specialist. Nothing more. SOCOM won't comment. And every time we try to dig deeper, we get told that the information is classified or that our clearance level isn't sufficient." Sarah had expected this. The very nature of her former unit meant that standard verification procedures would fail. The Ghost SEAL program had been designed to operate beyond traditional military structures, which made it nearly impossible to prove through conventional means. "Have you contacted the Pentagon?" Sarah asked. "We tried. They referred us back to SOCOM, who referred us back to the Navy, who referred us back to Personnel Command. It's like a bureaucratic circle that leads nowhere." The door opened and Coleman entered with a stack of newspapers and printouts from various websites. "You need to see this," he said, spreading the materials across the table. The headlines were sensational and damaging. "Fake female SEAL arrested for stolen valor. Woman's Navy SEAL lies exposed. Fantasy military service claims lead to federal charges." The articles painted Sarah as either a delusional woman seeking attention or a calculating fraud attempting to profit from fake military credentials. One particularly harsh piece from a military blog read, "This is exactly the kind of stolen valor case that makes real veterans sick. Some woman thinks she can waltz into a veterans bar and claim to be part of the most elite fighting force in the world. The fact that she chose to claim female SEAL status shows just how disconnected from reality she really is." Sarah read through the articles with a growing sense of despair. Her photograph, apparently taken from her driver's license, accompanied most of the stories. By now, her name and face were known to millions of people, all of whom believed she was a fraud. "There's more," Coleman said, pulling up a video on his tablet. "This is from a press conference held this morning by the Colorado Veterans Alliance." The video showed Marcus, the Marine sergeant who had confronted her at the bar, standing behind a podium with several other veterans. His face was red with anger as he spoke into a cluster of microphones. "This woman is a disgrace to everyone who has ever worn the uniform," Marcus declared. "She walked into our sacred space, looked us in the eye, and lied about serving in the most elite unit in the military. This isn't just stolen valor. It's a personal attack on every veteran who actually earned their place in the Brotherhood." The crowd of veterans behind Marcus nodded and murmured their agreement. Sarah recognized several faces from the bar, people who had seemed friendly just 24 hours earlier, but now looked at her with obvious contempt. Jake, the former Air Force pilot, stepped forward to add his comments. We've done our research since last night. There has never been a female Navy SEAL. The program only opened to women in recent years, and no woman has ever successfully completed BUDS training. This woman is either delusional or she's a criminal. Either way, she needs to be held accountable. The video continued with other veterans sharing their outrage and demanding that Sarah face the full consequences of federal stolen valor charges. Sarah watched in silence, feeling increasingly isolated as the very community she had hoped to join turned against her. The district attorney is under a lot of pressure to prosecute, Hayes said after the video ended. Military support groups are calling this a high-profile case that could send a message about stolen valor. What about my side of the story? Sarah asked. That's the problem, Coleman replied. We can't verify your side of the story. Every lead we follow ends with classification barriers or officials who won't comment. From the outside, it looks like you're making up an elaborate lie. Sarah stared at the newspaper headlines spread across the table. 24 hours ago, she had been an anonymous woman trying to build a quiet life in a small town. Now she was the face of stolen valor fraud, her reputation destroyed and her freedom in jeopardy. I need to make a phone call, Sarah said finally. Hayes raised an eyebrow. You want to call a lawyer? No, I want to call someone who can verify my story. We've tried calling everyone we can think of. Who exactly did you have in mind? Sarah hesitated. Making this call would mean exposing the last connection she had to her former life, potentially putting someone else at risk. But she was running out of options. There's someone at the Pentagon who recruited me for the program, General Patricia Morrison, Office of Strategic Planning. She's probably retired now, but she would remember me. Coleman made a note of the name. We can try reaching out to her, but if she's retired military, she's probably bound by the same classification restrictions as everyone else. Maybe, Sarah said. But she's also the only person who might be willing to risk her security clearance to save mine. As the officers left to make their calls, Sarah was returned to her cell to wait. Through her window, she could see that the crowd of protesters and reporters had grown larger. Some held signs reading "Prosecute Stolen Valor" and "Fake SEALs Dishonor Real Heroes." The irony was devastating. Sarah had spent years risking her life in service to her country, operating in the shadows to complete missions that regular forces couldn't handle. She had earned her place among the military's most elite warriors through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. But because her service had been classified and deniable, she now found herself branded as a fraud by the very community she had served. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her cell door opening. Hayes stood there with a troubled expression. We reached General Morrison, Hayes said. She's retired, but she agreed to speak with us. What did she say? Hayes paused, choosing her words carefully. She said she couldn't comment on classified programs, but she did say something interesting. She said that sometimes the most important service members are the ones whose sacrifices can never be publicly acknowledged. It wasn't the clear vindication Sarah had hoped for, but it was something, a small crack in the wall of skepticism that surrounded her claims. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we wait, Hayes replied. The DA is reviewing the case and there's talk of bringing in federal investigators. This thing has gotten too big for a small-town police department to handle alone. As Hayes walked away, Sarah returned to her window and watched the growing crowd outside. Somewhere in that mass of people demanding her prosecution were veterans who had served with honor and distinction. They deserved better than to be lied to, and Sarah understood their anger. But she also knew that the truth was more complicated than any of them could imagine. The ghost was being forced into the light, and the exposure was threatening to destroy everything she had worked to build. 3 days after her arrest, Sarah's case was transferred to federal jurisdiction when 2 FBI agents arrived at the Pine Ridge Police Station. Special Agent Rebecca Torres was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to handling complex investigations. Her partner, Agent David Chen, was younger and more reserved, carefully observing everything while Torres took the lead. Sarah had been moved to a conference room for the federal interview, a slight upgrade from the cramped interrogation room where she had spent most of her time. The media circus outside had only grown larger, with national news outlets now covering what they were calling the female SEAL hoax. Ms. Martinez, Torres began, settling into a chair across from Sarah. I'm sure you're aware that this case has attracted significant national attention. Stolen valor cases involving Navy SEAL claims are always serious, but the circumstances here are unusual. Sarah nodded, noting the careful way Torres had phrased her opening statement. Unlike the local police, the FBI agent seemed less convinced that this was a straightforward fraud case. Unusual how? Sarah asked. Chen spoke up for the first time. Most people who make false SEAL claims have obvious tells. They get basic facts wrong about military procedure. They can't answer detailed questions about training, or they contradict themselves under pressure. You haven't done any of that. Everything you've told the local police checks out in terms of general military knowledge, Torres added. Your understanding of special operations procedures, your familiarity with classified security protocols, your knowledge of operational areas and time frames. Either you're an extremely well-researched fraud, or there's more to your story than we can verify through standard channels. Sarah felt a spark of hope. These federal investigators seemed more open to the possibility that her claims might be legitimate, even if they couldn't prove it through traditional means. We've spent the last 72 hours trying to verify your story, Torres continued. Like the local police, we've hit classification barriers at every turn. But we've also noticed some interesting patterns. Chen opened a file folder and spread several documents across the table. Your official Navy record shows deployments that line up with significant special operations activities in various theaters. You were officially assigned to intelligence units, but those units were operating in proximity to SEAL teams during the exact time frames you mentioned. Sarah studied the documents, recognizing some of the operations mentioned, but noting that the details were heavily redacted. Even this limited information was more than she had expected the investigators to uncover. There's something else, Torres said, pulling out a photograph. We found this in the archived files from a mission in Afghanistan in 2007. The photograph showed a group of military personnel standing in front of a helicopter at what Sarah recognized as a forward operating base in Helmand Province. The image was grainy and partially obscured, but Sarah could clearly see herself in the background, dressed in combat gear and standing next to a man she remembered as her teammate on that particular mission. That's you, isn't it? Chen asked, pointing to the figure in the photograph. Yes, Sarah confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. Seeing the photograph brought back a flood of memories from that deployment, including the mission that had gone wrong and nearly cost her life. The interesting thing about this photograph, Torres continued, is that it was found in a file related to a classified SEAL operation. Your official record says you were attached to an intelligence unit providing support, but this image suggests you were more directly involved in the operation itself. Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said about the specifics of that mission could potentially compromise ongoing operations or endanger other personnel. Ms. Martinez, Torres said, leaning forward. We're going to ask you some very specific questions about your military service. I want you to understand that we're not just looking for reasons to prosecute you. We're trying to understand what really happened here. For the next 2 hours, the agents grilled Sarah with detailed questions about military procedures, operational protocols, and specific events from her claimed service history. They asked about weapons systems, communication procedures, medical training, and countless other details that only someone with genuine special operations experience would know. Sarah answered every question without hesitation, drawing on years of training and operational experience. She described the physical and psychological challenges of selection training, the specialized equipment used by her unit, and the unique protocols that governed their operations. Your knowledge is remarkably detailed, Chen observed after Sarah had finished describing the medical training required for her unit. Most people making false claims would have stumbled by now. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Torres said, pulling out another document. We managed to contact retired General Patricia Morrison, the officer you mentioned. She was very careful in what she said, but she did confirm that you served under her command during a classified program. Sarah's heart raced. General Morrison had been her commanding officer during the Ghost SEAL program, the person who had recruited her and overseen her training. If Morrison was willing to acknowledge their connection, even in limited terms, it was the first real validation Sarah had received. What exactly did she say? Sarah asked. She said that you were one of the most dedicated and capable operators she had ever worked with, Torres replied. She also said that the nature of your service meant that official recognition was impossible. but that your sacrifices were real and significant. The room fell silent as the weight of Morrison's words settled over them. For the first time since her arrest, Sarah felt like someone in authority was acknowledging the reality of her service. However, Torres continued, General Morrison also made it clear that she couldn't provide specific details about your operations or officially confirm your SEAL status. The classification levels involved are too high, and the potential security implications are too serious. Sarah understood. Morrison had done as much as she could without compromising national security or violating her oath to protect classified information. It was more support than Sarah had expected, but still not enough to clear her name publicly. So where does that leave us? Sarah asked. Chen and Torres exchanged a look before Torres answered. Honestly, we're in uncharted territory here. We have enough evidence to suggest that your claims might be legitimate, but not enough to prove it conclusively. The classification barriers are preventing us from accessing the information we would need for a complete investigation. What we can say, Chen added, is that this doesn't appear to be a typical stolen valor case. Your knowledge, your bearing, your consistent responses to detailed questioning, and the partial confirmations we've received all suggest that you have genuine special operations experience. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and frustration. The federal investigation had at least established that she wasn't an obvious fraud, but it hadn't cleared her name or ended the public perception that she was lying about her service. The district attorney is still considering whether to pursue federal charges, Torres explained. The evidence is complicated, and the political pressure from military advocacy groups is significant. But our report will note the unusual circumstances of this case and the classification barriers that prevented full verification. As the interview concluded, Sarah was returned to her cell to await the DA's decision. The media attention hadn't diminished, and she could see through her window that protesters were still demanding her prosecution. But for the first time since her arrest, she felt like the truth was beginning to emerge, even if it remained partially hidden behind walls of classification. The ghost was still trapped between two worlds, unable to fully prove her existence in either one. But at least now, some people in positions of authority were beginning to understand that the truth was more complex than it appeared on the surface. Outside her window, Sarah watched as Agent Torres gave a brief statement to the media, carefully explaining that the investigation was ongoing and that the case was more complicated than initial reports had suggested. It wasn't the vindication Sarah needed, but it was a start. On the 5th day of Sarah's detention, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Pine Ridge police station. A black SUV with government plates pulled up behind the media vans, and a distinguished woman in her 70s stepped out. Retired General Patricia Morrison moved with the measured pace of someone who had commanded respect for decades. Her silver hair perfectly styled and her posture ramrod straight despite her age. The reporters immediately recognized that something significant was happening, but Morrison walked past them without comment, her expression revealing nothing. Inside the station, Lieutenant Hayes received a call that the retired general was requesting a meeting with the prisoner. Sarah was brought to the conference room once again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Hayes and the FBI agents, Torres and Chen, were all present, their faces reflecting the gravity of having such a high-ranking former military official involved in the case. When Morrison entered the room, Sarah immediately stood at attention, old habits taking over despite her civilian clothes and the circumstances of their meeting. Morrison studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Sarah's appearance and demeanor. At ease, "Operator," Morrison said quietly, and Sarah could see the slight smile that crossed the general's lips as she used the old term of address. Morrison took a seat across from Sarah while the law enforcement officials arranged themselves around the table. The general's presence seemed to fill the room with an authority that transcended rank or jurisdiction. "Ms. Martinez," Morrison began, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to command, "I've been following your situation with great interest. The media coverage has been quite extensive." Sarah remained silent, unsure of what Morrison's presence meant for her case. The general had already provided limited confirmation of their professional relationship, but Sarah knew that anything more detailed could potentially compromise ongoing operations. "General Morrison," Agent Torres interjected, "we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. As we discussed on the phone, we're trying to verify Ms. Martinez's claims about her military service. Morrison nodded acknowledgement but kept her eyes focused on Sarah. Before we discuss specifics, I need everyone in this room to understand something about classified military operations. There are some types of service that can never be publicly acknowledged, not because they're shameful or illegal, but because acknowledgement would compromise ongoing national security interests. The room fell silent as Morrison's words sank in. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly out of her depth in dealing with matters of national security. The program that Ms. Martinez claims to have served in, Morrison continued, falls into that category. If such a program existed, and I'm not confirming that it did, the personnel involved would be operating under such deep cover that their true service could never be officially recognized. Chen leaned forward. General, are you saying that there are military personnel whose service records are deliberately falsified? Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral. I'm saying that in the world of special operations, the line between what appears to be true and what is actually true can be very different. Some of our most valuable assets are people who officially don't exist. Sarah watched the interplay between Morrison and the investigators, understanding that the general was walking a careful line between protecting classified information and providing some form of validation for Sarah's claims. The question before us, Morrison said, turning back to Sarah, is how to resolve the situation in a way that serves both justice and national security. Ms. Martinez, you've put yourself in an impossible position by revealing information that should have remained classified. I know, ma'am, Sarah replied, but I was being accused of stolen valor. I couldn't let that stand without defending myself. Morrison nodded understandingly. The accusations against you are particularly painful because stolen valor undermines the sacrifices of all military personnel. But your response has created a security problem that extends far beyond this local investigation. Torres spoke up. General, with respect, we need some form of official confirmation if we're going to recommend against prosecution. The district attorney is under enormous pressure from veterans groups to pursue this case. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she reached into her briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope. What I can tell you, Morrison said slowly, is that Sarah Martinez served with distinction in classified operations under my command. The nature of that service prevents me from providing specific details, but I can confirm that her claims about her military background are substantially accurate. The room erupted in questions from the investigators, but Morrison raised her hand for silence. There's more, she continued, opening the sealed envelope and removing a single sheet of paper. This is a letter from the Secretary of Defense written specifically for this situation. It confirms that Ms. Martinez's service record contains classified elements that cannot be publicly disclosed, and it requests that any criminal prosecution take these circumstances into account. Hayes stared at the letter in amazement. The Secretary of Defense wrote a letter about our case? When a former Special Operations personnel is publicly accused of stolen valor, Morrison explained, it creates ripple effects throughout the intelligence community. There are other operators whose covers could be compromised if this situation isn't handled carefully. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The letter from the Secretary of Defense wouldn't completely clear her name in the court of public opinion, but it should be enough to prevent criminal prosecution. However, Morrison continued, her tone becoming more serious, there are conditions attached to this intervention. Ms. Martinez, if charges are dropped, you will be required to sign additional non-disclosure agreements and submit to ongoing security monitoring. Your public statements about your military service must be carefully controlled. Sarah nodded her understanding. She had expected that any official intervention would come with strings attached. The world of classified operations didn't easily accommodate public vindication. Torres examined the letter from the Secretary of Defense. This appears to be legitimate, but we'll need to verify its authenticity through proper channels. You're welcome to do so, Morrison replied. But I think you'll find that it's very real and very clear in its implications. As the meeting continued, Morrison provided additional context about the challenges faced by personnel who served in highly classified roles. She explained how the very nature of their service made it impossible to provide traditional proof of their accomplishments. leaving them vulnerable to accusations of fraud when they tried to share their experiences with other veterans. The irony, Morrison said, is that some of our most heroic service members are the ones who can never be publicly recognized for their heroism. They operate in the shadows, sacrifice their anonymity, and often their post-service careers for the greater good. Sarah listened as Morrison painted a picture of the sacrifices made by covert operators, feeling validated but also saddened by the realization that her situation was not unique. There were others like her, ghosts who had given everything in service to their country but could never receive public acknowledgement for their sacrifices. "What happens to my reputation?" Sarah asked. "The media has already convicted me as a fraud. Even if charges are dropped, people will still believe I was lying." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Unfortunately, that's one of the costs of covert service. Your reputation among the general public may never fully recover. But those who matter, those who understand the true nature of special operations, will know the truth." As the meeting concluded, Morrison stood and approached Sarah. In a gesture that surprised everyone in the room, the general removed something from her pocket and placed it on the table in front of Sarah. It was a small military challenge coin, worn and scratched from years of handling. Sarah recognized it immediately as the unofficial symbol of the Ghost SEAL program, something that only personnel who had actually served in the unit would possess. "You left this behind when you separated from service," Morrison said quietly. "I thought you might want it back." Sarah picked up the coin with trembling hands, feeling the weight of memories and emotions that it represented. To everyone else in the room, it was just a piece of metal, but to Sarah, it was proof of everything she had claimed, validation of the sacrifices she had made. Morrison turned to address the room one final time. "Gentlemen, ladies, I trust that this matter can now be resolved appropriately. Ms. Martinez has served her country with honor, even if that service cannot be fully documented through traditional channels." As the general prepared to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at Sarah. "Welcome home, operator. It's been too long." The words hit Sarah harder than any physical blow she had ever received. For the first time since leaving the military, someone had acknowledged not just her service but her sacrifice. The ghost was finally being welcomed back from the shadows. The revelation of General Morrison's visit and the Secretary of Defense's letter sent shockwaves through the media circus surrounding Sarah's case. Within hours, the story had evolved from a simple stolen valor case to a complex tale of classified military operations and covert service members operating in the shadows. Sarah sat in the conference room watching the news coverage on Agent Torres's laptop. The tone of the reporting had shifted dramatically, with many outlets now questioning their initial assumptions about her guilt. Military analysts were being brought on television to discuss the existence of classified special operations programs that operated outside traditional military structures. The Department of Defense has confirmed that the letter is authentic, Torres announced as she ended a phone call with federal officials. The district attorney has decided not to pursue charges, citing the extraordinary circumstances and national security implications. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The immediate threat of criminal prosecution was over, but she knew that the larger challenge of rebuilding her reputation would continue for years to come. Lieutenant Hayes entered the room with a stack of papers. "Ms. Martinez, you're free to go. These are your personal effects and the paperwork for your release." Sarah gathered her belongings, including the challenge coin that General Morrison had returned to her. As she prepared to leave the police station, she realized that she would be walking directly into the media storm that awaited outside. "There's a back exit," Torres offered. "We can have you escorted out away from the cameras." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I've been hiding long enough. If I'm going to rebuild my life, I need to face this head on." Sarah walked through the front entrance of the police station and immediately found herself surrounded by reporters, shouting questions, and camera crews jostling for position. The crowd of protesters had thinned somewhat, but there were still veterans holding signs demanding answers about her service. "Ms. Martinez, can you comment on the Secretary of Defense's letter?" one reporter called out. "How do you respond to people who still think you're lying?" shouted another. Sarah stood at the top of the steps looking out at the sea of faces below her. Many were hostile, some were merely curious, but a few showed expressions that might have been understanding or even sympathy. I know that many of you don't believe my story, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd. I understand your skepticism and I don't blame you for it. The nature of my military service makes it impossible for me to provide the kind of proof that would satisfy everyone. The crowd quieted as Sarah continued speaking, her words measured and calm despite the chaos around her. What I can tell you is that I served my country for 23 years, and I did things that I can never talk about in detail. I worked alongside some of the bravest men and women in the military, people who sacrificed everything for missions that will never be publicly acknowledged. Marcus, the Marine sergeant who had initially confronted her at the bar, pushed through the crowd until he was standing at the front. His face was conflicted, no longer showing the clear anger that had driven him to call the police. If what you're saying is true, Marcus called out, then why didn't you just tell us that from the beginning? Why claim to be a SEAL specifically? Sarah looked directly at Marcus as she answered, because that's what I am. I know it's hard to accept, and I know it challenges assumptions about what's possible, but I earned my place in that brotherhood through the same trials and sacrifices as any other SEAL. Jake, the former Air Force pilot, stepped forward next. The general's letter doesn't actually confirm that you're a SEAL. It just says your service is classified. You're right, Sarah acknowledged, and I may never be able to prove it to your satisfaction. All I can do is tell you the truth and ask you to consider that maybe, just maybe, the world of special operations is more complex than what gets reported in the media. A voice from the crowd called out, "If you're really a SEAL, show us the scar." The reference was to a specific injury that Sarah had sustained during her final mission, one that had left a distinctive mark on her arm. It was a detail that had been mentioned in her interrogation, but not widely reported in the media. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then rolled up her sleeve to reveal a jagged scar that ran from her elbow to her wrist. The crowd fell silent as they saw the evidence of serious trauma. I got this during my last mission, Sarah said quietly. The same mission where my partner was killed. We were extracting a high-value target from a compound in Syria when everything went wrong. I spent 3 months in a military hospital recovering from my injuries, but officially I was never there. The rawness in Sarah's voice seemed to cut through the skepticism of many in the crowd. Even those who remained unconvinced could see that her emotions were genuine, that whatever the truth about her service, she had clearly experienced significant trauma. General Morrison appeared at Sarah's side, having returned to witness the media response to her intervention. Her presence seemed to lend additional credibility to Sarah's statements. I've served in the military for over 40 years, Morrison announced to the crowd. I've worked with hundreds of special operations personnel, and I can tell you that Ms. Martinez's knowledge, bearing, and responses are consistent with someone who has genuine experience in that community. A reporter from a national news network pushed forward with a microphone. General Morrison, can you confirm that Ms. Martinez was a Navy SEAL? Morrison's response was carefully measured. I can confirm that she served with distinction in classified special operations under my command. The specific details of her role and training are matters of national security that I cannot discuss publicly. The crowd began to disperse as it became clear that no more dramatic revelations would be forthcoming. Sarah watched as Marcus and several other veterans from the bar gathered together, their conversation animated but no longer hostile. Jake approached Sarah as the media began packing up their equipment. I owe you an apology, he said, extending his hand. I jumped to conclusions and I was wrong to do that. Sarah shook his hand, noting the genuine remorse in his expression. You were protecting something you believed in. I can't fault you for that. Marcus joined them, his own expression showing similar regret. Look, I still don't understand everything about your situation, but it's clear that you've served honorably in some capacity. I'm sorry for doubting you. The hardest part, Sarah replied, is that I can't give you the proof you deserve. I can't show you photographs from my missions or documentation of my training. All I can do is ask you to trust that some service members operate in spaces where traditional proof doesn't exist. As the crowd continued to thin, Sarah found herself standing with a small group of veterans who seemed willing to accept that her story might be true, even if they couldn't fully understand it. It wasn't the complete vindication she had hoped for, but it was a beginning. General Morrison approached as the last of the media vans pulled away. How are you holding up, operator? I'm surviving, ma'am. Same as always. Morrison nodded approvingly. The path ahead won't be easy. There will always be people who doubt your story, who believe you're a fraud despite everything that's happened here. Are you prepared for that? Sarah looked out at the small town of Pine Ridge, thinking about the quiet life she had hoped to build there. The anonymity she had sought was gone forever, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. I've been hiding from who I really am for too long, Sarah said. Maybe it's time to stop running from the truth, even if the truth is complicated. Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her former commander in years. Welcome back to the world, Sarah Martinez. It's good to have you back. 6 months after her arrest, Sarah Martinez stood behind the podium at the annual Veterans Day ceremony in Pine Ridge, looking out at a crowd that included many of the same people who had called for her prosecution. The journey from accused fraud to honored speaker had been long and complicated, marked by ongoing skepticism from some quarters but growing acceptance from others. The controversy surrounding her case had sparked a national conversation about the challenges faced by veterans who had served in classified roles. Military advocacy groups had begun developing new programs to support personnel whose service couldn't be traditionally documented, and the Department of Defense had quietly initiated a review of policies regarding covert operators transitioning to civilian life. Sarah had spent the months since her release working with General Morrison and other retired military officials to establish a support network for veterans in similar situations. They called it the Shadow Warriors Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping former covert operators navigate the unique challenges of post-service life. When I first came to Pine Ridge, Sarah began her speech, I was running away from my past. I thought I could build a new life by pretending to be someone I wasn't, by hiding the most meaningful part of my identity. In the audience, she could see Marcus and Jake sitting together in the front row, their expressions attentive and respectful. The transformation in their attitudes had been gradual but genuine, built on countless conversations over coffee and shared experiences at the Veterans Center that Sarah had helped establish. What I learned through this ordeal is that authenticity requires courage. It means being willing to tell the truth even when that truth is inconvenient, even when it challenges people's assumptions about what's possible. Sarah's eyes found Lieutenant Hayes, who had become an unexpected ally during the investigation. Hayes had used her experience with Sarah's case to develop new protocols for law enforcement, dealing with classified military service issues, helping other jurisdictions avoid similar situations. I can't prove every detail of my military service to every person who has doubts, Sarah continued. The nature of classified operations means that some sacrifices will never be fully acknowledged, some heroes will never receive public recognition. But that doesn't make their service any less real or meaningful. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Sarah had become an effective public speaker during her months of advocacy work, learning to channel her military discipline into powerful presentations about veteran issues. There are men and women who served in the shadows, who gave everything for missions that officially never happened. They operate in the spaces between countries, between policies, between what the public knows and what the public needs to know. When they come home, they face unique challenges in proving their worth to a society that doesn't understand their sacrifices. Agent Torres, who had remained in contact with Sarah throughout the aftermath of the case, watched from the back of the crowd. The FBI had used Sarah's situation as a case study for training agents on the complexities of investigating stolen valor, cases involving classified military service. But I've also learned something else during these past months, Sarah said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. I've learned that truth has a way of emerging, even from the deepest shadows. I've learned that real brotherhood isn't based on documentation or official records, but on shared values and mutual respect. Sarah paused to look at the small group of local veterans who had become her strongest supporters. After months of working together on community projects and veteran outreach programs, they had formed bonds based not on her claims about past service, but on her current actions and character. Some of you still have questions about my story, and I understand that. Some of you may never be fully convinced that my claims are true. But what I hope you'll judge me on is not what I say about my past, but what I do with my future. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, a stark contrast to the hostile reception she had received 6 months earlier. Sarah had earned her place in the community, not through proving her military credentials, but through dedicated service to local veterans and their families. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young woman in army dress, uniform who introduced herself as Captain Jennifer Walsh. Walsh explained that she was part of a new Pentagon initiative to study the transition challenges faced by personnel from classified programs. Ms. Martinez, your case has had significant impact on military policy, Walsh explained. The Secretary of Defense has approved new guidelines for supporting veterans whose service can't be traditionally documented. Your advocacy work has been instrumental in making this happen. Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction at the news. While she couldn't undo the damage to her own reputation, she could help ensure that other veterans in similar situations would have better support systems. General Morrison, now a regular visitor to Pine Ridge, joined the conversation. Sarah, I have some news that might interest you. The Navy is quietly developing a new program to provide limited public acknowledgement for personnel who served in highly classified roles. It won't include operational details, but it would provide official confirmation of Special Operations Service. The possibility of official recognition was something Sarah had never dared to hope for. While it wouldn't satisfy all her critics, it would provide the kind of validation that could help her rebuild her public reputation. There's one condition, Morrison continued. The program would require you to continue serving as an advocate for other veterans in similar situations. Essentially, you'd become the public face of an issue that has traditionally remained hidden. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Accepting would mean permanently giving up any hope of returning to anonymity, but it would also provide her with a platform to help others who faced similar challenges. I accept, Sarah said without hesitation. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself back at Murphy's Bar, the same establishment where her ordeal had begun. The atmosphere was completely different now, with her serving as a welcome member of the veteran community rather than an unwelcome intruder. Marcus raised his beer in a toast. To Sarah Martinez, a warrior who taught us that truth is sometimes more complex than we want to admit. Jake added his own words. And to the reminder that the most important battles are sometimes fought not on foreign soil, but in our own communities, against our own prejudices and assumptions. Sarah raised her own glass, thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost her anonymity, endured public humiliation, and faced the possibility of federal prosecution. But she had also found her voice, built meaningful relationships, and discovered a new mission that gave purpose to her post-military life. To the ghosts who serve in silence, Sarah said, and to the communities that learn to embrace them when they finally come home. Outside the bar, Pine Ridge had settled into its evening routine, a small town that had been forever changed by its encounter with a woman who challenged everything its residents thought they knew about military service. Sarah's story had become part of the town's identity, a reminder that heroes sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places, and that truth sometimes requires courage to accept. As Sarah walked home through the quiet streets, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her identity. The ghost had finally found a way to exist in the light, serving her country and her community in a new way while honoring the shadows that had shaped her. The challenge coin from General Morrison remained in her pocket, a tangible reminder of the brotherhood she had earned through blood and sacrifice. But now it was joined by a key to the Veterans Center she directed, a symbol of the new brotherhood she was building with those who had learned to see beyond the surface to the truth beneath. The ghost had found her way home at last, not by proving who she had been, but by showing who she had become.